She was 26 when Ronan Keane filed. It was not a conversation, it was not a fight. It was an event, executed with the clean, bloodless efficiency of a corporate takeover. She was away for 4 days on an offshore safety training exercise in the North Sea, a mandatory recertification for her work as a marine rescue technician. When the ferry docked back in Dublin, her phone, which had been off, lit up with a single, sterile text from his solicitor. It contained an address for a storage unit and a tracking number for a registered letter. At their apartment, the key no longer worked. On the doorstep, stacked with a strange, formal neatness, were her 2 hard-shell Pelican cases containing her rescue gear, her field bag with her certifications and logbooks, and a single cardboard box of her clothes. Taped to the top case was a manila envelope. Inside was a copy of the legal notice, a bank statement showing a 0 balance in their joint account, and a brief, typed note from Ronan. It did not mention love or sorrow or even anger. It spoke of irreconcilable futures and the practical necessity of a clean separation. He took the apartment they had chosen together, the lease now solely in his name. He took the Danish mid-century furniture they had saved for, each piece logged on a spreadsheet he kept. He took the car, the art from the walls, the books from the shelves. He took every quantifiable asset, every item with a clear market value that could be documented and divided. He had been methodical. He had been thorough. But he had not been complete. He forgot the one thing she owned that had never appeared on a spreadsheet, the one thing whose value could not be measured in euros. He had never known about the old lifeboat station her mother left her, perched on a black rock headland in County Clare, because the one time she had tried to describe it, he had cut her off. Decommissioned coastal buildings, he had said with the easy confidence of a property developer, were only worth the price of the land once you knocked them down. She had grown up understanding the Atlantic the way some children grow up understanding silence in a library. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of immense, shifting power. It was a language spoken in the crash of waves against rock, the hiss of foam receding over shingle, the low moan of the wind funneling through the sea arches at Fionuala Point. This understanding was a legacy, passed down not in words but in shared observation, in long walks with her mother, Bridget, along the cliff paths. Her mother had possessed the particular quality of stillness that comes only from a lifetime of watching the water. She could read the subtle shift in the color of the sea from slate gray to bottle green and know a squall was 3 hours out. She could smell a change in the tide on the wind. It was a form of knowledge that was elemental, ingrained, a second sight that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with paying attention. Bridget Malone had been a woman forged by the coast she served. For 20 years she was a volunteer on the Fionuala Point lifeboat crew, one of the first women to serve at the station. She was quiet, competent, and possessed a physical resilience that surprised men twice her size. She had joined the service after Tara's father, a fisherman named Colum, was taken by the sea. His boat went down in a sudden gale 15 miles off the coast, leaving behind nothing but a splintered hull and a silence in their small cottage. Bridget did not crumble. She did not rail against the ocean that had taken her husband. Instead, she turned to face it, to understand it, to serve on it. She learned to navigate in the dark, to handle the boat in a heavy swell, to pull desperate people from the cold grip of the water. It was her way of making a pact with the force that had shaped her life. She would not be its victim. She would be its counterpart, a small, stubborn human presence meeting its vast indifference with skill and courage. She raised Tara alone, instilling in her daughter not a fear of the sea, but a profound and abiding respect for it. She taught her how to tie a bowline with her eyes closed, how to read a nautical chart, how to judge the depth of the water by the shape of the waves. She taught her that the ocean didn't care about you, which was precisely why you had to care about it, with every fiber of your being. When the Royal National Lifeboat Institution decommissioned the old Fionuala Point station in favor of a new, more modern facility in the next bay, The building was set for public auction. It was a relic of the 19th century, a stone-built fortress with a slipway carved into the rock, designed for oar-powered lifeboats launched by the sheer will of the community. To the county council, it was a liability. To developers, it was a teardown. To Bridget, it was a sanctuary, a monument to generations of courage. She had spent years saving, working extra shifts at the local fish co-op, living with a frugality that bordered on asceticism. She never explained why, not really. Tara just knew that the station fund was a sacred line item in their household budget. On the day of the auction, Bridget stood at the back of the room, a small, determined figure among men in suits. She made one bid, a figure that represented every spare cent she had, and the room fell silent. No one dared bid against Bridget Malone for the soul of Fionuala Point. She bought it not as an investment, not as property, but as a promise to preserve the memory held in its salt-stained stones. It was her cathedral, her history, her heart. And 3 years ago, when a sudden illness took her with the same swiftness as an Atlantic storm, it became Tara's. Tara had met Ronan at a conference on coastal development in Galway. He was a speaker, charismatic and sharp, all clean lines and confident projections. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He listened. He asked questions about her work, seeming fascinated by the technical details of sea survival and rescue operations. He called her competent and capable, and for a while she believed he saw her for who she was. She moved to Dublin for him, taking a job that was more classroom-based, teaching safety protocols to corporate clients, spending less time on the water and more time in meeting rooms. The city felt loud and landlocked, the air thick with exhaust instead of salt. She began to feel a slow, creeping sense of disconnection, a subtle unmooring from the person she had always been. Ronan loved the idea of her. He loved telling his friends that his partner could save a man from a force 10 gale. It was a story, a piece of impressive trivia to add to his collection of assets, but he never truly saw the woman behind the story. He never understood that her competence wasn't a skill she performed, but the very substance of her being. Their life together became a series of transactions. He kept a running tally of expenses, of favors given and received, of emotional debts. He valued what could be measured, and she was a creature of the immeasurable, of instinct and heritage, and a deep, quiet connection to a world he could not quantify. The failure of their relationship wasn't a single event, but a slow erosion, like a cliff face worn away by a relentless tide, until the final, inevitable collapse. The bus ride to Clare was a long, gray blur of rain-streaked windows and the low hum of the engine. Tara sat with her field bag on her lap, a hard-shell case containing the essentials of her life. Her certifications, her passport, her mother's photograph, and the 237 euros she had managed to pull from a cash machine before Ronan's solicitor put a freeze on everything. She watched the manicured suburbs of Dublin give way to the flat, green Midlands, and finally to the rugged, stone-walled fields of the West. The air changed. As the bus neared the coast, she could smell it through the recycled air of the cabin, a faint, briny tang that felt like coming home. She got off in the small village of Lisdoonvarna and walked the last 2 miles to the solicitor's office, the sea wind pulling at her jacket. Mr. O'Connell was a man in his late 70s with eyes the color of the winter sea and hands gnarled like ancient driftwood. He had been her mother's solicitor and friend, a repository of local history and secrets. He greeted her not with pity but with a quiet, knowing respect. "Tara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I was sorry to hear about your troubles. Your mother was a fine woman, the finest." He didn't ask for details. People of the coast understood that some storms simply had to be weathered. He pushed a heavy, bound ledger across his desk and turned it for her to sign. The transfer of the deed had been arranged by Bridget years ago, a seamless transition upon her death. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a key. It was enormous, made of heavy, rusted iron, its shape archaic and intricate. "She left this here for you," he said, "for when you were ready to come home." He wrapped her hand around its cold weight. "The roof will need seeing to after the winter storms. There's a good man, Declan Walsh. His number is in the file. Your mother trusted him, said he understood stone and slate." She walked the final mile out to the headland. The path was narrow, winding between outcrops of limestone and patches of resilient sea thrift. The wind was stronger here, a constant living presence that carried the cries of gulls and the deep, percussive roar of the waves breaking on the rocks below. And then she saw it. The Fionuala Point lifeboat station stood exactly as she remembered, a bastion of gray stone and weathered slate against the turbulent sky. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was stark, functional, almost severe. Its walls were stained dark with sea salt and time. Its windows were small and deep-set like watchful eyes, and the great double doors facing the slipway were faded to a pale, sea-bleached blue. It looked less like a building and more like a natural extension of the cliff itself, something that had grown out of the rock, shaped by the same relentless forces. It was in a state of visible disrepair, missing slates, peeling paint, windows clouded with salt spray, but its bones were good. She could see it in the clean, solid lines of the stonework, in the unyielding posture of the structure against the wind. It had the quiet dignity of a thing built to last, a thing built with purpose. She stood for a long time, just looking, the iron key growing warm in her hand. This was not an inheritance of property. It was an inheritance of strength. The key turned in the massive lock with a grating shriek of metal on metal that echoed in the sudden stillness. The heavy wooden door swung inward, opening into darkness, and the thick, preserved air of a place left undisturbed. The smell hit her first, a complex layering of scents that was the station's unique signature. Cold stone, damp salt, creosote from the old timbers, a faint metallic tang of rust, and beneath it all the clean, sharp smell of the sea itself, which seemed to have seeped into the very mortar. She stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind her, and was enveloped in a profound quiet. The roar of the ocean outside suddenly muffled to a distant, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. Light filtered in through the grimy windows of the boat hall, illuminating a cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of sun. The ceiling soared 2 stories high, crisscrossed with massive wooden beams from which block and tackle still hung, silent and expectant. The concrete floor sloped gently down towards the massive slipway doors, and she could see the grooves worn into it by the keel of the lifeboat, decades of launches carving their history into the stone. The building felt empty but not abandoned. It felt like it was waiting. She spent the first hours exploring, reacquainting herself with the layout she knew from childhood visits. To the left of the boat hall was the crew room, a small wood-paneled space with a stone fireplace, built-in wooden benches, and a single large table. On the wall, a rack of old oilskin coats still hung, stiff and spectral. Upstairs was the watchroom, a small chamber with windows on 3 sides offering a panoramic view of the wild Atlantic, and a tiny sleeping quarters with 2 narrow bunks. Every surface was covered in a fine layer of salt and dust. She ran her hand along the worn wood of the table in the crew room, remembering her mother sitting here, drinking tea from a flask with the other crew members, their faces ruddy from the wind, their quiet camaraderie filling the small space. It was here, her mother had once told her, that you found out who a person really was. Not in what they said, but in how they held their cup, how they watched the sea, whether they were the first to stand when the bell rang. Her mother had also told her stories about the old equipment, particularly the Boxer life-saving apparatus, a Victorian-era rocket system used to fire lines to ships in distress. It had been retired long before her mother's time, but the station had kept one of the original equipment lockers as a historical artifact. It was a tall, dark wood cabinet that stood against the back wall of the boat hall. Her mother had always spoken of it with a particular fondness, tapping its side and saying, "Everything you need to start over is in here." At the time, Tara had assumed it was a metaphor for the courage and ingenuity the rocket represented. Now, standing in the cold, dusty hall with less than 300 euros to her name, she wondered if it might mean something more. She ran her hands over the cabinet's surface, feeling the grain of the old wood. She opened its doors. Inside were neatly coiled ropes, a brass firing pistol, and a wooden box of signal flares, all inert museum pieces. It looked exactly as it should. But she remembered the specific way her mother had tapped the back of the cabinet. A hollow, resonant sound. She pushed aside the coiled ropes and pressed against the back panel. It was solid. She pressed again, running her fingers along the seams, searching for a latch or a spring. Nothing. Then she remembered her mother's love of knots. On the inside of the cabinet door was a small, decorative brass hook from which hung a short length of frayed rope tied in a complex, unfamiliar knot. It looked like a mere decoration, but on instinct she began to untie it, her fingers finding the familiar rhythm of working a line. As the final loop came undone, she heard a soft, mechanical click from inside the cabinet. She pushed on the back panel again, and this time it swung inward, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Inside the compartment sat a single object, a large rectangular biscuit tin, its painted label of a smiling sailor long faded. It was sealed shut with a thick layer of wax around the lid. With trembling hands, she carried it over to the crew room table and used the tip of her rigging knife to break the seal. The wax flaked away, brittle with age. She lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was a thick, folded piece of paper resting on top of a carefully packed bundle. The paper was old and heavy, with the faint watermark of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. It was a letter, written in her mother's strong, clear handwriting. She unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Tara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have come home to Fionnuala Point, and that your heart is in need of a safe harbor. I am sorry I am not there to offer it to you myself. Know that this place will hold you. It has held me through my own storms, and its stones have more strength and memory than any person. I have left you what I could. It is not a fortune, but it is a beginning. It is the money I saved from the sea, from years of mending nets and working the tides. Use it to make this place whole again, and in doing so, you will make yourself whole too. The world outside this headland, the world of men who measure life in numbers and contracts, can be a cold and shallow water. They will try to tell you what has value. Do not listen. True value is in the things that cannot be bought or sold. A steady hand, a clear eye for the weather, and a place to come back to. This station is not a house, it is an anchor. Let it hold you. The roof needs work. Declan Walsh is the only man I'd trust on it. Be good, be brave, and watch the tides. All my love, Mame." Tears streamed down Tara's face, hot against her cold skin. She read the letter again, and a third time, the words "a balm on the raw wound of the past week." It was her mother's voice, calm and sure, reaching across time to steady her. Finally, she set the letter aside and looked back into the tin. Beneath where it had lain was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She untied the twine and unfolded the thick, waterproof fabric. Inside were stacks of old banknotes, 50 and 100 euro notes, bound with rubber bands. And nestled amongst them, heavy and gleaming in the dim light, were dozens of gold sovereigns, their weight solid and real in her palm. She sat at the table for over an hour, carefully counting. It came to just over 42,000 euros in cash, and the gold coins were worth at least another 15,000. It was not a fortune, as her mother had said, but it was more than enough. It was enough to begin again. The first call she made was to Declan Walsh. He answered on the second ring, his voice a warm Claire burr. When she introduced herself as Bridget Malone's daughter, his tone softened. "Ah, Bridget's girl. I remember you as a little one, all knees and elbows, learning the sheet bend from your mother down at the pier. A true woman of the sea your mother was. The best. What can I do for you?" She explained about the station and the state of the roof. "I'll be out tomorrow morning at 7, he said without hesitation. "We'll have a look." He arrived the next day as promised, his truck rattling up the path just as the sun was rising over the Burren. He was a small, wiry man with a face weathered like the local limestone, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He spent a full hour on the roof, walking its length, tapping slates, checking the flashing around the chimney stack. When he came down, he gave her a quote that was, she knew, substantially less than the work was worth. "Your mother gave my brother an extra 10 minutes in the water when his trawler went down off the Aran Islands," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "It's the least I can do. We'll start Monday." The work was hard, physical, and deeply satisfying. Declan refused her offers to pay for another laborer, instead agreeing to let her work as his assistant. He taught her how to use a slate ripper and cutter, how to mix the lime mortar just right, how to lay the heavy blue slates in overlapping courses that would shed the fiercest Atlantic rain. She spent her days on the roof, high above the churning sea, the wind whipping her hair, her muscles aching with a clean, honest fatigue. She learned the rhythm of the work, the scrape of the trowel, the sharp crack of a slate being cut to size, the solid thud of the hammer driving home a copper nail. With every slate she helped lay, she felt like she was healing a wound, not just on the building, but within herself. The methodical, repetitive labor cleared her mind. The endless calculations of Ronan's world, of profit and loss, of assets and liabilities, faded away, replaced by simpler, more tangible realities. The weight of a slate in her hand, the angle of a roof pitch, the threat of an approaching rain cloud. She was building something real, something that would provide shelter, something that would endure. After the roof was finished, a great solid shield of dark slate, she turned her attention to the interior. The work became a kind of meditation, a slow, patient reclamation of the space. She started with the windows, scraping away years of accumulated salt and grime until the glass was clear, letting bright, clean light flood into the boat hall and the crew room. The view of the ocean, once obscured, was now a stunning, ever-changing mural of water and sky. She scrubbed the stone floors on her hands and knees, watching the dark, porous rock lighten as she worked. She took on the wood paneling in the crew room, a project that took her 3 full weeks. She carefully sanded down the old, darkened varnish, revealing the beautiful grain of the original pitch pine beneath. Then she rubbed it with linseed oil, her hands working the fragrant oil into the wood until it glowed with a deep, warm luster. She polished every piece of brass in the station, the door handles, the window latches, the old bell, until they shone like gold. She didn't buy furniture. She used what was there. The long table in the crew room became her desk, her dining table, her entire world. The built-in benches, with the addition of a few cushions she stitched herself from old sailcloth, were her seating. One of the narrow bunks upstairs became her bed. Her life was stripped down to its essentials, and in that simplicity she found a profound sense of peace. The station was no longer just a building. It was becoming an extension of herself, its quiet strength mirroring her own returning resilience. With the station structurally sound and habitable, she needed to find work. She knew she couldn't stay isolated on the headland forever. She drove into the nearby town of Doolin and saw a small, hand-painted sign in the window of an adventure tourism company. Coastal safety instructor needed. The owner was a man named Seamus, his face a friendly map of laugh lines, his hands strong and calloused from a life on the water. When she handed him her CV, he glanced at her name. "Malone?" he asked, his eyes lighting up. "Any relation to Bridget Malone from the Fionuala Point crew?" When she confirmed she was her daughter, he broke into a wide grin. "I served with your mother for 5 years," he said, his voice full of warmth and reverence. "She taught me more about handling a boat in rough seas than the official trainers ever did. When can you start?" He hired her on the spot, not just for her extensive qualifications, but for her lineage. He knew that being Bridget Malone's daughter meant she didn't just know the sea, she understood it. She started the next week, taking on part-time work, leading sea kayaking tours, teaching coastal navigation, and running safety drills. The work felt good. She was back on the water, her skills valued, her knowledge respected. She was part of a community that shared her language, the language of tides and wind and water. On her days off, she began a new project, one that was purely for herself. It was the restoration of the station's name, painted in large, white block letters above the main slipway doors. The original paint was almost completely gone, flaked away by a century of salt and storms, leaving only a faint ghost of the words Fionuala Point Lifeboat Station. She spent days researching the original typeface, finding old photographs in the local library. She bought marine-grade paint, the kind used for the hulls of fishing boats, and the best brushes she could find. Then, high on a scaffold, she began the slow, meticulous work of repainting the letters. It was a public declaration. It was a way of saying that the station was not a ruin, not a forgotten relic, but a place with a name, a history, a living guardian. Each stroke of the brush felt deliberate and meaningful. She was not just painting letters on a wall. She was reclaiming a legacy, making her mother's promise visible to the world. As the weeks turned into months, the headland became less isolated. Word had spread through the local community that Bridget Malone's daughter had come home and was bringing the old station back to life. People began to visit. At first, it was just a few old fishermen, men who had served with her mother, who would stop by on their way to check their pots. They would stand in the boat hall, their eyes full of memory, and share stories. They told her about the great rescue of '87, when her mother had been at the helm in a Force 9 gale, bringing in the crew of a stricken French trawler. They told her about the quiet, everyday courage that defined life at the station. Then came others. A local artist who asked permission to sketch the station, a historian who wanted to document the original equipment, a group of school children on a field trip, their faces full of awe as Tara showed them how the old rocket line system worked. She would make them all tea, and they would sit at the long table in the crew room, and the space would fill with voices and warmth. She was no longer just the custodian of the station. She was a part of its continuing story, a link in a chain of community and service that stretched back over 100 years. She felt a sense of belonging that was deeper and more real than anything she had ever known in the bustling, anonymous streets of Dublin. The storm rolled in on a Tuesday morning in late November, a proper Atlantic howler that turned the sky to bruised pewter and the sea to a chaos of white-frothed peaks. The wind shrieked around the corners of the station, and waves exploded against the base of the cliffs, sending plumes of spray halfway up to the watchroom windows. Inside, the station was a sanctuary of calm. The new roof held firm, not a single drop of water finding its way through. A fire crackled in the crew room hearth, and the thick stone walls muted the storm's fury to a distant, reassuring roar. Tara had spent the morning finishing the final letter on the great sign above the doors. She had waited for a day with no wind, but the Irish coast rarely offered such a gift, and she had grown tired of waiting. She had worked through the morning, lashed to the scaffolding for safety, applying the final, perfect coat of white paint to the letter N. Now she was on the ground, cleaning her brushes, feeling a quiet sense of completion. It was then that she saw the car. It was a sleek, silver Audi, utterly alien in the wild landscape, its pristine finish already being beaded with salt spray. It navigated the rough track to the station with a kind of hesitant delicacy, its low-profile tires struggling on the uneven ground. It parked a short distance away and Ronan got out. He was dressed for a city meeting, not a coastal storm. He wore a tailored wool overcoat, a cashmere scarf, and expensive polished leather shoes that were instantly ruined by the muddy, waterlogged ground. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the vast, elemental drama of the landscape. He stood for a moment, his coat flapping in the wind, looking at the station, his face a mask of bewilderment. He saw the new slate roof, the gleaming windows, the freshly painted name shining bright and defiant against the dark stone. He saw her, standing by the slipway doors, her face flushed from the wind, her hands stained with paint, looking completely, unshakably at home. He walked towards her, picking his way carefully around the puddles. "Tara," he said, his voice thin against the wind. I heard you were down here. I didn't know." His eyes scanned the building, the slipway, the roaring sea beyond. There was a look on his face she had never seen before. Not arrogance, not confidence, but a dawning, uncomfortable confusion. It was the look of a man who prided himself on his thoroughness, on his ability to assess the value of any asset, realizing he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "This place?" he stammered. "It's impressive." He was seeing it now through the lens of its potential, its uniqueness, its sudden, undeniable value. He had come, she realized, to see what he had missed, to tally the final column in his ledger. She didn't answer him at first. She simply continued her task, dipping a brush into a jar of turpentine, her movements calm and deliberate. The simple, physical act grounded her, kept her anchored in her own reality, not his. She would not be pulled into his world of awkward apologies and veiled negotiations. He took a step closer. "I was in the area for a site visit," he said, a flimsy, transparent lie. "I thought I'd see how you were. I wanted to say that I was sorry. The way things ended, it was a mess." She finally stopped what she was doing and looked at him. She felt no anger, no bitterness. She felt a strange, quiet clarity, a vast distance that had nothing to do with the physical space between them. "You never asked, Ronan," she said, her voice even and clear, not carried away by the wind. "In the 3 years we were together, you never once asked about my mother. You never asked about this place. You never asked where I came from." He had the grace to look ashamed. He looked down at his ruined shoes, then back at her, a flicker of desperation in his eyes. He saw her then, truly saw her, not as an accessory or a story, but as a complete person, rooted in a place and a history he had never bothered to discover. He saw the strength in her, a strength that had nothing to do with him, and he wanted it back. "Is there," he began, his voice hesitant, hopeful, "is there anything left to say? Anything we can fix?" She looked at him, at the man who had emptied their life into boxes and bank transfers, who had left her with nothing but what he couldn't count. She thought of her mother's letter, of Declan Walsh's kindness, of the stories shared around the fire, of the deep, quiet satisfaction of her own hands making a place whole. And she knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing he could ever offer her that she needed. She gave him the gift of a clean, final truth. "No," she said. It was not a word spoken in anger, but in peace. "No, there isn't." He held her gaze for a long moment, searching for a crack, an opening, and found none. He nodded once, a small, defeated gesture. He turned without another word, walked back to his immaculate car, and drove away, leaving nothing behind but tire tracks that were already filling with rain. That evening, the storm passed. The wind dropped to a whisper, and the sea settled into a long, deep swell, its surface like polished obsidian under a sky wiped clean and filled with stars. Tara walked out onto the slipway, the stones still damp beneath her feet, and sat on the edge, her legs dangling over the dark water. This was the exact spot where generations of men and women had stood, waiting to launch, their faces turned towards the vast, unforgiving darkness of the Atlantic. They had pushed their boats down this very slope, into the chaos, not for money or for glory, but because someone was in trouble, and they were the ones who could help. It was an inheritance of duty, of quiet courage, of showing up. She looked up at the station, her station, its dark form silhouetted against the starry sky, a single warm light glowing in the crew room window. She thought of her mother, Bridget, who had poured all her love and loss and strength into the preservation of this place. She had not left her a building. She had left her a compass, a fixed point in a turning world. She had left her the knowledge that the deepest treasures are not the ones you can lock in a vault, but the ones you carry inside you: resilience, competence, and a connection to something larger than yourself. Ronan's world was one of acquisitions and ledgers, of things that could be owned and, therefore, lost. Her mother's world was one of service and legacy, of things that could only be earned and, therefore, could never be taken away. The lighthouse beam from the far point swept across the water, illuminating her for a moment before moving on, a steady, repeating rhythm in the immense dark. Ronan had taken everything he could document. He had taken the accounts, the lease, the furniture with receipts. He had systematically stripped away every layer of the life they had built, leaving her, he thought, with nothing. He had left behind the only thing that mattered. He forgot the old lifeboat station her mother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.